Hi, it's Clyde. You found your way back to another one of my very boring adventures, which is already a good sign that your brain is ready to slow down and drift a little. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet and a little misty and full of footsteps that don't hurry anymore. Before we sink into all that, this is the part where I gently remind you to tap the like button while you're still awake enough to find it. It honestly helps more than you'd think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you can do that now too, so you don't have to remember any of this later, when you're half asleep and trying not to move a muscle. I've gathered all of my boring adventures into one playlist, so if you happen to wake up in the middle of the night, you can just let them keep playing in order. Clock shops, rainy streets, pies that take forever to cool, and now a foggy gathering in London in the year 1919. You don't have to keep track of where you left off. You can just let Clyde wander around time and do nothing very important while you rest. And if you decide to become a channel member, well, first of all, thank you. It really does help me keep making these sleepy little trips, but it also means I can make a personalized sleepy story just for you, with your own details tucked in like an extra blanket. Still quiet, still slow, still very boring, just yours. All right. If you're ready, you can let your shoulders soften. Maybe let your jaw unclench a little. You don't need to do anything. I'll do the standing around and the listening. Tonight, I'm attending a veterans gathering in London in the year after the Great War. People murmur. A bell tolls. I fold my hands and close my eyes, and I say nothing at all. London in 1919 feels like it has exhaled, but not quite breathed in again. The fog is doing that very London thing where it pretends to be shy and then suddenly gets nosy, slipping between buildings, investigating coat collars, touching the ends of people's noses. I'm standing on a broad, damp street, somewhere not far from the Thames, surrounded by a slow-moving crowd of people who have all decided to be quiet at the same time. Mostly men. Mostly in dark coats. Some uniforms, medals that catch whatever light there is and flash it back, small and stubborn. A few women with stiff hats and determined chins, and here and there, a child holding a hand a little too tightly. I stand among them with my hands folded in front of me as if I've always belonged here. My coat is a plain brown that doesn't draw attention, and beneath it, I can feel the reassuring weight of my pocket watch against my chest. It's not the most accurate watch in the world, but it tries very hard, which I respect. The first thing I really notice, though, is the sound of shoes. There's something about the way footsteps echo on wet stone, polished boots, worn soles, an occasional limp, that tells you more about a person than any introduction could. Some steps are careful, like the person isn't sure the ground will stay under them. Some are heavy and determined, as if they're marching against something invisible. One set of footsteps behind me has a faint scrape to it, the sound of a metal tip on a walking stick. Somewhere nearby, a pigeon coos from the top of a lamp post, sounding offended that no one brought breadcrumbs to this particular event. Another pigeon waddles determinedly along the curb, looking like it's late to its own very important meeting. There's the smell of coal smoke and damp wool, and also something more comforting, a hint of tea from a nearby stall, steam rising like a small ghost when someone lifts the lid of a kettle. I can't see the stall through the crowd, but I imagine a chipped enamel teapot and a stack of mismatched cups, one with a hairline crack that everyone pretends not to notice. To my left, there's an older man with a thick mustache and a bowler hat that looks like it has survived several adventures of its own. He wears a dark coat, and on his lapel, a single bright red paper poppy is pinned slightly crooked, as if it was attached in a hurry on the way here. His hand trembles just a little where it rests on his cane, and when the wind tugs at his coat, I see a row of service ribbons on his chest. He doesn't look at me. No one does, really. I'm just another figure in the crowd, another shape in the fog. That's one of the things I like about these gatherings. You can stand very close to people and still feel like you're wrapped in your own little pocket of silence. Somewhere ahead, in the direction everyone's faces are turned, a large bell hangs in a stone archway. It's dark and heavy, the metal dull from age and weather. A rope disappears into the belfry, and every so often it twitches as if remembering that soon it will be called upon to do its part. Behind the bell, beyond the shifts and shuffles of coats and hats, I can just make out the outline of a familiar clock tower, its face pale in the foggy light. The hands creep toward 11 with all the determination of a cat that has decided to walk across a piano very slowly. I don't say anything. I just stand there and feel the weight of the moment pressing gently but firmly on everyone's shoulders. A dog appears at the edge of the crowd, trotting along with that guilty look dogs get when they're not sure if they're allowed somewhere. It's a scruffy terrier with one ear that doesn't match the other. It pauses near my boots, gives my trousers a brief and unimpressed sniff, then settles down with a sigh that seems too big for its small body. Somewhere behind us, a tram clanks along its tracks, sounding like an old man clearing his throat. Life continues at the edges, even while this small patch of street decides to stand very still. I draw in a slow breath, tasting the fog and coal dust and the ghost of someone's breakfast. Fried bread, I think, and perhaps a bit of kipper, clinging stubbornly to a scarf. It's not a bad smell, just determined. I close my eyes for a moment, hands still folded, and let the murmur of voices wash around me like the tide coming in around a rock. I don't need to say anything. There's more than enough being said in the rustle of coats and the shifting of feet. And so I stand, quietly, as London tries to remember how to breathe again. When the clock finally reaches 11, it does so with the air of something that has done this many times before and will keep doing it long after we're gone. Somewhere high above us, gears engage, and the bell begins to toll. The sound is slow and heavy, each note spilling out over the city like water poured from a great height. It rolls over rooftops and curls down alleys, seeps into open windows and under doors. Here, in the crowd, it seems to hang in the air between us, pressing gently against our chests. And then, as if a conductor no one can see has lifted a hand, the murmuring stops. The silence that follows isn't empty. It crackles very softly, like paper being folded. Someone clears their throat once and then seems to regret it for the rest of the 2 minutes. A baby somewhere lets out a single, astonished "ah," and is immediately soothed back into quiet against a woolen shoulder. I stand with my eyes open this time, looking at the faces around me. There's a man whose uniform doesn't quite fit anymore, hanging a little looser than it was designed to. His cap sits too low, shadowing his eyes, but I can see the way his jaw works as if he's chewing over something he can't quite swallow. On his sleeve, just visible when the wind moves his coat, is an empty space where an arm should be. The sleeve is pinned carefully, neatly, tucked away, as if the missing limb has simply gone on ahead and is waiting somewhere. Beside him, a woman in a dark dress stands very straight, her gloved hand wrapped around the arm of a boy who looks to be about 12. The boy's shoes are too big, the kind you grow into. He is trying very hard to look solemn, but keeps sneaking glances at the bell, as if counting each swing. A paper poppy is pinned to his chest, slightly higher than everyone else's, because the adult who fastened it was taller. I notice a little cluster of small things at my feet that seem to have gathered here on purpose. A crumpled bus ticket, a cigarette stub, a single brass button, and a matchbox with a faded picture of a ship on it. The matchbox is empty, but someone has folded it shut again carefully, as though they might still need the picture. Somewhere in a nearby upper window, a cat sits on the sill, tail wrapped around its paws, watching the stillness below with the inscrutable expression that cats reserve for human ceremonies. The fog makes its fur look slightly blurred around the edges, as if even the cat isn't entirely sure it's here. The bell continues. Each toll feels like it's being written into the air, letter by letter. I find myself counting them without meaning to, the way you can't help counting stair steps. The world, for just these moments, seems to decide that there will be no clattering plates, no shouted greetings, no haggling at market stalls. Even the tram, which had previously been clanking along with great enthusiasm, goes quiet, as if it has stopped itself just out of respect. I don't know all the names this silence is for. No one does. That's the strange, gentle thing about it. It belongs to millions of people and to no one in particular, all at once. My thoughts wander, the way they tend to do, like a dog that has slipped its lead. For a heartbeat, I picture another city, another time, different uniforms, different flags, another crowd standing very still for the memories they carry. But this moment is here, in 1919 London, where the streets still remember the sound of victory whistles and air raid sirens, and where some people are still glancing upward out of habit, just in case. A light breeze picks up, carrying with it the smell of wet stone, coal smoke, and something unexpectedly sweet. Roasted chestnuts, I realize, from a vendor who has paused mid-scoop, his paper cones of nuts waiting patiently in a wire basket. One of the chestnuts has rolled away and come to rest against a man's boot, perfectly still, as if observing the silence too. The bell finally tolls its last slow note. The sound fades into the mist, leaving behind that faint ringing you get inside your own ears when everything has been too quiet for just a little too long. For a few seconds, nothing happens. No one moves. It's as if the whole crowd is holding its breath, unsure how to start the world up again without making too much noise. Then, somewhere off to the right, a single cough breaks the spell, another follows, and then the soft murmur returns, like a tide creeping back over sand. Voices start up again, low, careful, as if people are afraid of stepping on the silence they just shared. I still haven't said a word. I just breathe out slowly, feeling the air leave my lungs and vanish into the fog, and let myself be one more quiet person among many, carrying thoughts I don't intend to share. After the silence ends, people begin to shift their weight from one foot to the other, as if the ground has been holding them in place and is only now giving them permission to fidget. The older man with the bowler hat and the trembling hand on the cane is still on my left. Now that people are talking again, the cane taps the pavement every so often with a soft, impatient click, like a metronome that isn't entirely sure of the tempo. He glances at me once, briefly, and in that glance I get the sense that he has placed me among the many faces here and immediately misfiled me. I'm not wearing a uniform or a particular set of ribbons after all. Just a brown coat, a calm face, and a pocket watch that might mean something or nothing at all. At his other side stands a man who looks younger, though not by much, wearing a cap pulled low and carrying a folded newspaper under one arm. The paper is damp at the corners where the fog has begun to curl its way into the ink. Every so often, he taps the edge of it against his leg, an unconscious rhythm. I still hear it, the older man says quietly, not exactly to the younger one and certainly not to me, but somewhere in the air between us. The younger man doesn't ask what it is. He just nods, looking straight ahead. There are some things you don't need translated. A pigeon chooses this moment to land almost comically close to the older man's shoes, giving us all a suspicious side eye. It pecks once at the pavement, finds nothing of interest, and then notices the brass button and empty matchbox near my boots. After a moment of serious consideration, it decides buttons are not edible and hops away with an air of disappointed dignity. Behind us, a cart rattles past, its wheels making a sound like loose cutlery in a drawer. It's piled with wreaths of greenery and poppies, a few of them tilting slightly because whoever stacked them got a little too confident after the first layer. A boy walks beside the cart, steadying it with one hand and eating something out of a paper packet with the other. Probably the chestnuts that were meant to be sold. I let my mind drift, following the sound of the cart, the tap of the cane, the rustle of newspapers and wool. The older man shifts his weight and turns his head the slightest bit toward me, not enough to be exactly addressing me, but enough that his words can find me if they want to. "You'd think it would be quiet now," he murmurs, almost more to his cane than to either of us. "After all that." The younger man gives another nod. "Never really is it?" Their conversation drifts on the surface like two leaves on a pond. I don't wade in. I simply stand, listening, my hands still folded, my face slack in a way that encourages the world to overlook me. A little gust of wind lifts the edge of my coat, and I become briefly aware of a small object in the inner pocket. A smooth stone I'm very carefully not thinking about, yet I let the coat settle back into place and focus instead on the older man's cane. It has a carved handle in the shape of a hound's head, the wood worn shiny where his fingers have gripped it again and again. The crowd begins to loosen around us, people turning to one another, leaning in to speak, the sound of greetings and memories mingling into a low hum. Somewhere, a woman laughs once, quickly, and then covers her mouth as if she's not sure laughter is allowed today. Nearby, a child is pulling determinedly at his mother's sleeve, whispering that he's hungry, that he smells chestnuts, and also something that might be sausages, and that he doesn't see why remembering the fallen can't be done while eating both. The mother makes soft, shushing sounds and promises they'll get something soon. A single white feather drifts down from nowhere in particular, twirling lazily in front of my face before landing on the brim of the older man's hat. It sits there for a moment, a tiny, accidental decoration, before the wind tips it again and sends it spinning onward. The man with the cane doesn't notice. His gaze has gone far away, to some field or trench or stretch of sea that isn't visible on any map, and I can almost feel the ache of it radiating from him like heat. I still say nothing. Sometimes, the most respectful thing you can do is stand still and be one more quiet presence in a world that is trying very hard to live with its own echoes. The fog thickened just enough that everyone's outlines became a little softer, like charcoal sketches that hadn't been sprayed with fixative. It gave the morning an uncertain shape, as if the whole city was still deciding what it wanted to look like for the rest of the day. Beside me, the younger man with the damp newspaper gave it a frustrated shake. That only made it more crinkled and less trustworthy looking, which newspapers tend to take personally. It folded itself back into a mushy accordion and sagged in his hand like it had lost its will to continue reporting the news. He muttered something under his breath about bloody damp, which was a very fair critique of London in general. The crowd was slowly beginning to dissolve at the edges, people drifting in different directions, mostly toward tea, warmth, and anything that wasn't standing still in the cold. A few lingered the way people do when they aren't quite ready to leave the company of others, even if no one had actually spoken. Just then, a sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far side of the square. Everyone flinched in unison, which was an impressive bit of choreography for people who hadn't rehearsed. It turned out not to be anything ceremonial, but rather a metal pail that had slipped out of an old man's grip as he tried to stack it with others on a cart. The pail continued to roll across the cobblestones with a spirited metallic rattle, full of the type of enthusiasm usually reserved for puppies and children who have swallowed too much air. The terrier from earlier perked up with great interest, deciding this might be the most entertaining thing happening today. It chased the pail in looping circles, its nails tapping a cheerful rhythm on the stones. Several people tried not to smile. One woman failed completely and let out a tiny chuckle she immediately tried to hide behind her scarf. I watched the pail roll right between the legs of a particularly stern veteran whose posture suggested he had once commanded people who were now buildings. He didn't move a muscle except for a single, slow blink. Behind us, a church door creaked open, one of those deep wooden groans that sounds like the building itself is waking up. A vicar stepped out, holding an umbrella he clearly hoped would act as a threat against the weather rather than an actual tool. His glasses fogged up instantly, turning him into a kindly blur. He cleared his throat as if preparing to say something important, but then seemed to realize no one was looking his way, so he pivoted and pretended he had come outside merely to examine the clouds. Meanwhile, the younger man with the newspaper finally managed to flatten it, though the lower left corner insisted on curling up like a rebellious fern. He sighed and turned to the older man with the cane. "You want to stop in at the Lion and Crown?" he asked him quietly. The older man gave a small shrug. "Might or might not. Never know until my feet start walking." His feet, at that moment, appeared to have no particular agenda. As he shifted his cane, I noticed again the carved dog's head on the handle. Sharp ears, smooth snout, eyes that had probably been painted once but were now worn blank. I wondered who carved it, and whether the person ever imagined their handiwork would be standing in a foggy London square next to a silent time traveler who wasn't supposed to exist. A gust of wind swept in from the river and rustled through everyone's coats. It brought with it the distant hum of a street organ playing something cheerful and slightly out of tune. An odd contrast, but London has always enjoyed emotional multitasking. At that moment, a very determined woman appeared, marching through the crowd with a basket full of bright red poppies. She had an expression suggesting she had no intention of letting anyone escape without one. She moved like a small, unstoppable ship through the sea of dark coats, her hat bobbing with each confident step. She approached the older man with the cane first. "Sir, you've lost your poppy," she announced, pulling a fresh one from the basket before he could protest. "I haven't lost it," he said mildly. "It's in my pocket." "Yes, well, pockets are no good for remembering," she replied, and pinned the poppy on him before he had time to object. Then she turned to me. "You too, dear," she said, already reaching. I didn't move. People often assumed I was the sort of person who knew where he belonged in a given moment, and she was no exception. She pinned the poppy to my lapel with practiced fingers and gave a firm nod of approval, as if I had passed a quiet test I wasn't aware of taking. The terrier returned from its chase and sat neatly by my boot, looking up at me with the expectant eyes of a creature who assumes I might have snacks I did not, but I admired its optimism. Somewhere deep in the fog, a train whistle sounded. A long, lonely wail that drifted over the rooftops and hung in the air like a ribbon. The day was moving on. Slowly, like someone waking up after difficult dreams, but moving all the same. And I was still there, quiet, unnoticed, hands folded, watching history breathe around me. The square had mostly emptied by the time I found myself drifting along with the gentle current of people who had decided that remembrance was best followed by something warm to hold. London seems to have a law, unwritten but universally obeyed, that after any emotional moment, someone will put a cup of tea in your hand before you have the chance to protest. The fog had thickened again, carrying the smell of coal smoke and something faintly lemony, which I hoped was from a bakery and not from whatever a horse had done earlier in the street. I didn't speak to anyone. I simply walked at the same pace as the crowd, which is the easiest way to blend in with Londoners. Move neither too quickly nor too confidently. To my right, an older woman in a long grey coat marched with great determination, holding a small tin kettle as if prepared to conduct her own emergency tea service. The kettle's lid rattled with every step, making it sound like it was trying to escape. Ahead of me, the boy with the poppy pinned too high on his coat tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mum," he whispered, "is the fog thicker now, or is it just following us?" His mother gave a soft laugh. "It's London, dear. It always follows you." A little farther along, a soldier with 3 medals and a very droopy moustache was arguing gently with a vendor over whether a cup of tea should cost 1 penny or 2. The vendor insisted on 2. The soldier insisted on 1. The fog, trying to be diplomatic, hid their faces every few seconds. I paused near a small handcart that had somehow become a makeshift tea stand. It was run by a woman with sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a look of fierce purpose, and a spoon she wielded like a general directing troops. Steam curled around her face as she ladled tea from an enormous enamel pot that surely had been dented by history itself. "Cup?" she asked, without looking at me, already pouring. I nodded, and she handed it over, hot, fragrant, and somehow managing to smell both comforting and slightly burnt. A pigeon regarded me near my boots, one eye narrowed as if trying to determine whether I was the sort of man who dropped crumbs. I wasn't, but it seemed to decide I might do so eventually and repositioned itself optimistically closer. The fog parted briefly, and I caught sight of the older man with the hound-headed cane. He was standing alone now, staring at something I couldn't see, something only he carried. His cane tapped once, twice, in a slow rhythm that might have matched a memory. I felt a soft nudge at my ankle. The terrier had returned and was sitting at my feet again, looking up with an expression that could only mean, "This is a cold day, and I have chosen you as my source of warmth." I lowered my free hand, just enough to let it sniff my fingers. It approved, or pretended to. A man in a cap approached the tea vendor and asked, "Any chance you've got sugar?" "Not today," she said briskly. "Milk?" "Not since the war began." He sighed, accepting this like someone who had been disappointed many times but still believed in miracles. The steam from the tea warmed my face. My glasses, if I had been wearing any, would have fogged hopelessly. As it was, everything simply existed in a soft blur that felt oddly appropriate for a morning of remembering things half hidden by time. Somewhere across the street, a brass band attempted to start a tune but gave up when half the instruments let out embarrassed squawks. They settled instead on tuning themselves very enthusiastically, which sounded suspiciously like geese arguing. My mind wandered, drifting between the clatter of the cups, the murmur of voices, the flicker of wet street lamps, and the very distant chime of another bell somewhere upriver. It was the kind of moment where nothing needed to be said, and so I said nothing. I stood quietly with my tea in the fog, with a terrier at my feet, while London exhaled again, slowly, cautiously, learning how to be a city of the living after so much loss. After finishing my tea, which warmed my hands far more than my insides, I drifted along with the thinning crowd until the street seemed to branch into several directions at once. London does that sometimes. Streets turn corners without warning, narrow into alleys, or widen into unexpected squares, as if the city is deciding its shape, moment to moment. I wasn't in a hurry. I rarely am. The terrier trotted alongside me for a few paces, glancing up repeatedly as if trying to decide whether to adopt me. Eventually, it spotted a man unwrapping a meat pie across the street and veered off with an air of deep regret, like someone leaving a pleasant conversation because someone else is offering pastries. The fog shifted, revealing a tall lamppost on the corner with a little plaque attached to it. The plaque announced the street name in letters so chipped they looked exhausted. The name might have been Westminster Lane, or Watermint Lane, or was that a lane? The fog smudged the last two letters unhelpfully. A man on a bicycle emerged from the mist, ringing a bell that sounded slightly apologetic. His tires hissed over wet cobblestones, leaving two thin, dark lines behind him. He passed by carrying a wicker basket full of newspapers, each one rolled tight and tied with string. One of them fell out as he pedaled away, bouncing once before coming to rest near my feet. I looked at it for a moment, considering whether picking it up would suggest I had any intention of reading it. Newspapers in 1919 had an unfortunate habit of containing news, something I was generally not in the market for. Still, it seemed lonely sitting there on the ground. I leaned down and set it upright against the lamppost so the fog wouldn't flatten it further. The fog did not appreciate being resisted and swirled around my ankles in response. Down the street, a small delivery cart rattled toward me, led by a horse who looked like it had strong opinions about Mondays, even though it definitely wasn't Monday. The cart was loaded with crates labeled EGGS, though several hens perched on the top crate seemed unsure whether they approved of this marketing plan. One hen stared at me with the expression of someone prepared to judge my entire personality in 3 seconds or less. I kept walking. On my left, a bookshop stood with its front window fogged over from the inside, candles flickering behind the glass. The books displayed in the window were arranged in a very deliberate pyramid, though the topmost book kept sliding just a bit, leaning like a tired man against his neighbor. A sign taped crookedly to the door read, "Open, mostly." A young clerk in rolled-up sleeves stood behind a small table outside, sorting a stack of second-hand novels into piles labeled "Drama, Not Quite Drama," and The third pile was winning. "Cold morning," he said, glancing up. I nodded. "Fog's worse by the river. You headed that way?" I did not answer because Clyde generally does not answer questions he isn't required to answer. He took my silence as a sign of deep philosophical thought. "Well, watch your step if you do," he added. "Barges blowing their horns every 10 minutes. Nearly walked straight into one yesterday." I gave him a polite half-smile and continued on, letting the heel of my boot click softly on the cobblestones. Farther down the lane, 2 elderly women stood arm in arm beneath a shared umbrella. They spoke in low voices. One of them carried a bag of knitting, the end of a half-finished scarf dangling out like a long, red tongue. She didn't seem to notice. Every few steps, the scarf tapped lightly against the ground in a kind of rhythmic scolding. A bus trundled past, sputtering a bit, its windows clouded from the combined breathing of every person inside. Painted on its side was an advertisement for something called Mr. Fairweather's Miracle Liniment, which claimed to cure aches, pains, coughs, fatigue, sadness, horseshoes loosening, and something called general life troubles. It seemed ambitious even for a miracle. As the bus rumbled away, I became aware of a man standing beside a newsstand, staring at me, not suspiciously, just curiously. He wore a tweed coat and a flat cap, and his glasses were fogged so thoroughly he might not have been able to see me at all. "You from around here?" he asked. I stayed silent. "Didn't think so," he said, as if that solved everything. "You've got the look of someone trying to figure out which way's forward." He wasn't wrong. He tipped his cap and returned to examining a box of postcards for one that had the least water damage. A sudden clang sounded behind me. One of the hens on the delivery cart had leapt off and was now pecking at a metal bucket with alarming determination. The deliveryman sighed so deeply, I think he aged 3 years on the spot. "Not again," he groaned, retrieving the hen like someone lifting an unruly child who had made a break for the biscuit tin. The fog shifted again, revealing a narrow cut-through alley to my right. It looked like a place where a sensible person would not go, which is to say, it looked exactly like the kind of place London often hides interesting things. I didn't enter it. Not yet. I simply stood at the edge of the street, hands in my coat pockets, feeling the city breathe around me. The air was cold enough to sting, warm enough to stay, and quiet enough to let the far-off sounds of bells and horns echo without interruption. I didn't know where I was going, but the street didn't either. We were in agreement. I stood at the mouth of the narrow alley for a long moment, letting the fog drift out of it in slow curls, as if the alley were exhaling after holding its breath far too long. London alleys always seem slightly alive, breathing, listening, remembering things they don't intend to share. I stepped forward anyway. The cobblestones were uneven here, the kind that make every footstep sound like it has a question mark at the end. A metal drain pipe clung to the side of the nearest building, rattling faintly every time the wind nudged it, like an elderly man clearing his throat to remind you he's still present. Halfway down the alley, I noticed a wooden crate stamped with the words, "Handle with care," though the way it had been wedged beneath a window suggested no one had obeyed that instruction. Perched inside the crate was a small black cat with a single white whisker on one side, giving it the look of a creature who had started to age but changed its mind halfway through. The cat stared at me like I was interrupting a private appointment. I gave it a polite nod. It blinked once, slowly, and decided to allow my existence. Farther along, a clothesline stretched overhead from one building to another. A few garments hung limply, mostly shirts and a pair of trousers that had seen better decades. At the end of the line, a single sock hung defiantly alone, clipped by a wooden pin. The sock was striped and cheerful in a way the rest of the alley absolutely was not, and it swayed gently, as if it had an opinion about the wind. A voice echoed up ahead. Two voices, actually. One belonged to a woman. The other technically belonged to a man, though it had the weary tone of someone who had been thoroughly defeated in an argument he did not know he was part of. "It is the same broom," the woman was saying in the firm, instructional tone of a school teacher. "I simply replaced the handle when it snapped." "That's not the same broom," the man protested. "A new handle makes it a different broom." "It's the same broom, Alfred." "It isn't." "It is." I rounded the corner and found them standing outside a tiny back entrance to what appeared to be a bakery. The woman held a broom with a brand new wooden handle. The man held the old handle, the end jagged where it had split. Between them on the ground lay the original broom head, its bristles frayed into an impressive approximation of despair. The woman caught sight of me first. She gave a wave, still holding the broom. "Good morning," she called, as though we were standing in the middle of a bright meadow instead of a damp alley. I gave a small nod of greeting. The man, Alfred, inspected me with a squint that suggested he wasn't sure whether I might somehow be on the broom's side. "You look like a sensible fellow," the woman said. "Tell him it's the same broom." I blinked, unsure whether my silence counted as participation. They both waited. My silence stretched. Alfred sighed with the air of a man who has been proven wrong by someone who hasn't even spoken. "Fine," he muttered. "Same broom." The woman looked enormously pleased and leaned the broom against the bakery door. As she turned, a warm, sweet smell drifted out, a scent of rising dough, sugar, and something faintly citrusy. Even the fog hesitated, unsure whether it should continue being fog or become steam from the ovens. Alfred, still holding the broken handle, muttered. He didn't even say anything. "That's because some men know when silence is the more intelligent contribution," she replied cheerfully. And with that, she disappeared inside, leaving the door cracked open just enough for the aroma of baking rolls to escape like hopeful ghosts. I took a small step back to let the warm air pass me. It wrapped around my face in a soft little cloud before dissolving into the alley's damp chill. Alfred gave me one more suspicious look, then set the broken broom handle atop a stack of firewood, where it immediately rolled off and clattered to the ground. He sighed, picked it up, set it back. It rolled again. Eventually, he gave up. I continued down the alley, stepping around puddles that reflected faint outlines of overhanging windows and laundry fluttering like sleepy flags. The alley narrowed, then curved gently until it spilled back out onto a wider street where an early evening glow, dim but present, filtered weakly through the fog. Somewhere not far away, a clock chimed softly, its voice gentle, almost shy. I paused at the alley's exit and looked back once. The striped sock waved at me again. I waved back. Sometimes that's all a day needs. The wider street beyond the alley felt almost bright compared to the dim little corridor I'd just walked through, though bright in 1919, London fog is really just a polite way of saying less gloomy for the moment. I stepped out onto the cobblestones and immediately heard the crisp flip-flip-flip of papers being shuffled by someone with purpose. A newspaper vendor stood behind a small wooden stand, surrounded by bundles of rolled papers tied with string. The fog made the stand look like it was floating slightly, the edges soft, as if the news itself was trying not to be seen too clearly. The vendor was an older fellow, wiry and quick-eyed, wearing fingerless gloves that had clearly outlived better days. His cap was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested stubborn optimism. Without looking up, he called out, "Morning paper, stories from yesterday, opinions from last year." No one seemed to be buying anything, but he announced it anyway, determined not to let the fog or the silence claim his voice. A pigeon strutted in front of the stand, likely the same one that had investigated my boots earlier. It paused, examined the corner of a newspaper, and pecked at it in a way that implied it disagreed with the editorial stance. The vendor finally noticed me standing a few steps away. "Paper?" he asked, holding one out with the enthusiasm of a man offering a winning lottery ticket. I didn't take it. He looked me over with a squint, the kind people use when they're trying to place a face they're certain they've seen somewhere before, like a policeman's notice board or perhaps a dubious pub painting. "You're a quiet one," he said. "Quiet folk don't usually read the news. Too noisy for 'em." He put the paper back in the stack without waiting for me to confirm. Behind him, pinned crookedly to the stand, was a small hand-painted sign, "Free with every paper, a fact mostly true." The vendor tapped the sign proudly and leaned toward me as though about to reveal something confidential. "Would you like today's mostly true fact?" he asked. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no, which he confidently interpreted as interest. He cleared his throat and announced in a theatrical whisper, "Did you know that fog is made when the sky gets tired of holding its breath?" He waited, watching for my reaction. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage while still counting as a nod. He beamed. "See? Makes sense, doesn't it?" A woman passed by with an armful of wrapped parcels, stepping neatly around a puddle the way Londoners do when they've memorized every uneven stone in the city. The vendor called out to her, "Paper, miss? Today's edition includes an opinion piece about why pigeons can't be trusted." The pigeon puffed up indignantly at the accusation. "No, thank you," the woman said politely. The vendor lowered his voice again, speaking to me like a man sharing a secret he could no longer keep. "You know, I've been selling papers since before the war. Used to have lines of people waiting. Couldn't keep the ink dry long enough. Now folks avoid the news like it's catching." He shrugged. "Can't blame him. Bad news is heavier in the fog. Sticks to you." He stacked a few papers into tidy piles, smoothing the edges carefully with one gloved hand. Then he added, almost absent-mindedly, "Still, someone's got to tell the city what it already knows." A tram bell clanged somewhere upriver. A carriage wheel splashed through a puddle, sending tiny droplets flying. A woman with a basket of oranges walked past, their bright color looking almost rebellious in the muted morning. The vendor reached over and grabbed a small tin cup from beneath his stand, filled with something steaming from a kettle I hadn't noticed. He took a sip and winced. "Tea's terrible this morning," he muttered. "Made it too strong, or too weak. Hard to tell." He held the cup out slightly toward me. "You want a sip?" I did not take it. He nodded as if I had declined politely through a detailed monologue. Fair enough. It's more of an acquired punishment anyway. A sudden gust of wind swept through, lifting the top layer of newspapers. One rolled copy tumbled off the stand, hitting the cobblestones with a soft thud and unrolling itself dramatically, as though making an entrance. The headline was immediately obscured by fog. The vendor sighed, retrieved it, shook it dry, and tucked it back into the stack. "City's breathing heavy today," he murmured, almost to himself. "Feels like we're all waiting for something to happen, even if none of us knows what." He glanced back at me once more, his expression somewhere between curiosity and understanding. "Wherever you're heading," he said softly, "take your time getting there. Streets are gentler when you wander." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in the air. With that, I stepped past the stand, my shoes tapping softly on the wet stones, the fog curling around me like a quiet companion. The vendor called after me, voice warm and slightly muffled. "Come back if you want tomorrow's news told like a bedtime story." I kept walking. In 1919 London, even the news sometimes knew when to whisper. The fog thickened once more as I continued down the street, curling around the tops of lamp posts and settling into the folds of coats like a cat choosing comfortable laps. The city hummed quietly beneath it all, the kind of hum that felt like the leftover echo of things people had tried very hard not to say. Before long, the buildings thinned and the faint smell of the river drifted toward me. Cold water, damp stone, and a hint of something metallic. The Thames in 1919 always seemed older than the city around it, like it had outlived several Londons already and was waiting patiently to outlive several more. I followed the sound of distant horns and the slosh of water until the shape of a bridge emerged, its stone arches rising from the fog like the ribs of a sleeping giant. The lamps along its railing glowed faintly, halos forming around each flame as if the fog needed a reason to sparkle. A lone figure stood halfway across the bridge. He leaned against the railing with the posture of someone who had been traveling for a long time but wasn't sure whether he wanted to reach the end. His coat was too thin for the weather, which suggested he had either misplaced his heavier one or had quietly decided he deserved to be cold for a while. When his gaze lifted toward me, it wasn't sharp or startled, just tired in the way that comes from having lived through more than any person should be asked to. He didn't speak, so I didn't either. We stood a few paces apart, both leaning on the railing in our own way, looking out toward the pale blur that was the river. Barges moved below us, mostly just vague lumps of shape and shadow, each one announcing its existence with a long, low horn that seemed to vibrate through the fog rather than cut through it. On one barge, the silhouette of a man pulled a rope hand over hand. His movements were steady, unhurried, like he had a lifetime to tie that knot. A gull drifted overhead, its wings slicing through the mist with quiet effort. It landed on the far side of the bridge railing and immediately began cleaning itself with offended dignity, as though the fog had done it a personal injustice. A horse-drawn cart clattered behind us, the driver flicking the reins lightly. The horse's hooves made that steady, hollow sound against the stone. Clop, 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 the kind of sound that lives in the memory of a bridge long after the horse is gone. The man beside me finally spoke, his voice low and frayed. "Feels different now, doesn't it?" He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. That's often the best way to share difficult thoughts. He tapped a gloved finger against the railing. "I used to cross this bridge on my way home from the factory. My wife would be waiting, kettle already on." A soft silence followed. "Doesn't feel like the same bridge now." I stayed quiet. Silence is often more companionable than conversation. He continued, barely above a whisper. "Funny thing is, nothing here's changed." Another pause. "Except me." A small boat below released a burst of steam, hissing into the sky like an impatient kettle. The sound drifted upward and wrapped itself around us before dissipating. The man's gloved hands tightened slightly on the railing. Then he spoke again, almost to the river. "Some days, I think the world's trying to remember how to be alive after forgetting for so long." A barge horn answered him from somewhere in the mist. He let out a breath that had been sitting inside him for years, perhaps. Then he turned, just enough that I could see the shape of his face more clearly. Not the details, but the weight of the things behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "I hadn't done anything, Then again, sometimes standing beside someone in silence is doing something. He stepped away from the railing, adjusting his coat as if preparing to fit himself back into a world that didn't quite sit right yet. When he walked past me, his footsteps were slow but steady, each one sounding slightly more certain than the last. I watched him disappear into the fog until even the echo of his steps was swallowed. A moment later, the wind nudged the fog aside just enough for the river to reveal a small glimmer of light, reflected from a window somewhere upstream, floating like a tiny lantern on the water. I let my hands rest loosely on the cold stone railing. London, I realized, was a city that carried its ghosts gently. And on mornings like this, when the fog wrapped everything in soft edges, you could almost hear the city whisper to itself, "We're still here, we're still trying." And I stood with it, quiet, unhurried, letting the river breathe beneath the bridge that remembered everything. I left the bridge slowly, letting the steady rhythm of my footsteps guide me back toward the quieter parts of the city. The fog seemed to settle deeper the farther I walked, folding itself around corners and drifting between buildings like it had nowhere better to be. London was beginning to shift into late afternoon, the lamps glowing softly, the river darkening slightly, the sounds becoming rounder and calmer. People passed me in quiet pairs or small clusters, their voices low, like everyone understood the day needed gentleness. The cobblestones beneath my boots had taken on that glossy sheen they get when fog settles into the cracks. My breath hung faintly in the air ahead of me. Somewhere behind a row of narrow shop fronts, a violinist practiced slow scales, notes that drifted like moths toward the street and dissolved into the mist. The melody wasn't sad exactly, just patient. I turned down another narrow lane and found myself near a row of terraced houses with their curtains half drawn. A baker's boy hurried out of a side door, carrying a tray of rolls that steamed into the cold air like little clouds escaping captivity. He didn't notice me as he passed, nearly bumping into my coat before nodding apologetically and rushing on. A cat lounged on a doorstep nearby, possibly the same one from the alley, possibly just a relative of similar temperament. It blinked at me slowly, which seemed to be the universal feline gesture for "you may continue existing in my presence." The fog muffled everything, turning the whole block into a quiet pocket of London that felt slightly outside of time. I reached the end of the lane and stopped beneath an old iron street lamp whose flame flickered softly behind the glass. And that's when I felt it. A faint, familiar warmth, barely more than a suggestion, settling into the pocket of my coat. Not a glow, not a hum, just presence. The smooth stone I carried stayed silent most of the time, doing whatever mysterious job it had been assigned by the universe. But occasionally, when I drifted through enough of a moment, or learned whatever quiet thing time wanted me to learn, or simply spent long enough standing still, the stone would give the gentlest nudge, as if to say, "It's time." I rested my hand on the outside of the coat, feeling the warmth seep through just enough to confirm it. Before leaving, I let myself absorb the last few breaths of the fog-damp air. Somewhere not far off, a cart rattled by, its wheels clacking against the cobblestones. A woman laughed, softly, as if still testing whether laughter fit the world again. The violinist played another slow scale, and somewhere upriver, the bell from the veterans' gathering tolled one last time for the day, quiet, distant, but steady. I closed my eyes for a moment and let every piece of this place settle into some quiet corner of my memory. The river fog, the murmured conversations, the smell of tea and chestnuts, the way the city breathed with both sorrow and hope at the same time. London in 1919 was a place still learning how to live again. It had let me walk through its morning, unseen and unhurried, and now it seemed to offer a small, gentle nod of farewell. The stone warmed once more against my palm. I curled my fingers around it inside the coat. The street lamp flickered. The fog shifted. The seams between moments loosened, and the world began to fold softly away, like a page turned very slowly in a very old book. Until next time, I thought. And then the quiet London street dissolved into another place entirely. My next very boring adventure was waiting.